My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 74 years old. 5 weeks ago, I underwent emergency open-heart surgery, a triple bypass that my cardiologist described as genuinely life-threatening if left untreated even a few more days. My daughter-in-law, Kayla, knew the surgery date nearly 2 weeks in advance. On the morning of that surgery, while I was being wheeled into the operating room, she was 3 counties away at a Bridal Expo, sampling cake flavors for a wedding still 11 months out. 5 days after I came home from the hospital, still recovering, still moving carefully across my own kitchen, she called me needing my signature on paperwork to access an early distribution from a trust fund I control. Money she needed, urgently, to cover a deposit on a venue before someone else booked it first. If you've ever needed someone in the hospital and found silence where their presence should have been, stay with me until the end. Because this story isn't about refusing to help my daughter-in-law when she came asking. It's about what it costs and what it requires to give help honestly after being let down in a moment that genuinely mattered. Welcome to Silent Honor USA. If this story speaks to you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because you'll want to see exactly what happened when I finally told her the truth about that morning. I need to tell you about my son and his marriage before I tell you about that surgery, because otherwise the weight of what happened won't fully land. I spent 39 years as a partner at a mid-sized accounting firm outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, building, over those decades, both a genuinely comfortable retirement and a particular reputation for careful, conservative financial judgment that eventually led my late husband Walter and me to establish a family trust fund when our son Michael was still young, a mechanism intended to provide long-term security for future generations of our family, structured with specific provisions requiring my signature, as trustee, for any distribution outside the standard annual disbursement schedule. Walter worked as a civil engineer for most of his career, a man whose entire professional temperament was built around careful, methodical planning, and together we approached the trust the same way we approached most significant decisions in our marriage, slowly, deliberately, with considerable discussion about what kind of long-term security we actually wanted to build for a son who was, at the time we established it, barely out of elementary school. I remember specifically the conversation, sometime in the early 1990s, where Walter first suggested requiring trustee approval for any distribution outside the standard schedule, a provision I initially resisted slightly, worried it might someday feel restrictive or controlling toward whatever family Michael eventually built. Walter's response has stayed with me across the decades since. "Eleanor," he said, "money without judgment attached to it isn't security, it's just a number waiting to be spent carelessly. We're not trying to control Michael's life. We're trying to make sure someone who loves this family is paying attention before significant money moves. So it actually protects people instead of just disappearing into whatever feels urgent in a given moment." I've thought about that conversation often in recent weeks, given everything that's happened. Walter passed 8 years ago, a sudden stroke that gave us no warning, and since then, I've continued managing that trust alone, taking the responsibility seriously, the way I've taken most responsibilities seriously across my working life. Understanding that the money represents not simply numbers, but decades of careful discipline meant to protect people I love, long after I'm no longer here to protect them directly. Michael, my only child, is 43 years old, a successful architect who built his career in Charlotte, staying close enough that I've been able to remain genuinely involved in his adult life in a way many parents of grown children never get to experience. He married Kayla 4 years ago, his second marriage, following a difficult divorce in his mid-30s that I watched him navigate with real pain. And I want to be honest that I approached Kayla, from the beginning, wanting genuinely to welcome her, understanding how much healing Michael had needed to do before he was ready to build something new. Kayla is 36, works in event planning, a career that, I've come to understand over the past 4 years, shapes considerably more of her worldview than I initially appreciated. A professional lens that measures significance largely through visibility, presentation, and the particular kind of polish that translates well into photographs and public celebration. I don't say that to diminish her career, which represents genuine skill and real professional accomplishment. I say it because I think it matters to understanding the pattern that developed between us over the following years, particularly once Michael and Kayla began planning their own wedding, an event that, 18 months into their engagement, has apparently grown into something considerably more elaborate than either of them originally intended. I noticed, over the past year particularly, a shift in how Kayla related to me, a coolness that seemed to correlate, not entirely coincidentally I think now, with the period when wedding planning intensified and when Kayla, I later learned, began having more direct conversations with Michael about the trust fund and what portion of it might eventually support their wedding and their broader financial future together. I want to be fair to Kayla here, because it would be easy to paint her simply as callous, and that isn't the complete picture of who she actually is. She's been, in most respects, warm and attentive toward Michael, genuinely invested in building a life with him, and I don't doubt the sincerity of her feelings for my son. What I've watched develop, though, particularly over recent months, is a tendency to treat family obligations, including obligations toward me specifically, as flexible commitments that yield readily whenever something wedding-related emerges as more urgent, a pattern I initially dismissed as ordinary bridal enthusiasm before it revealed itself, 5 weeks ago, as something considerably more troubling. About 6 weeks ago, during a routine cardiac stress test that had been scheduled following some concerning symptoms I'd been experiencing, my cardiologist discovered significant blockages across 3 coronary arteries, serious enough that he recommended immediate hospitalization and surgical intervention within days, rather than allowing for any extended scheduling flexibility. I called Michael the same afternoon I received that diagnosis, and I called Kayla separately that same evening, wanting both of them to understand clearly the seriousness of what was happening and the specific date, set for the following week, when the surgery would occur. Kayla expressed what sounded, at the time, like genuine concern, asking good questions about the procedure, telling me she'd be there, that she wanted to support Michael through what was clearly going to be a frightening day for him as well. I remember feeling genuinely touched by that reassurance, given the coolness I'd noticed developing between us over recent months, allowing myself to believe, in that moment, that whatever tension had been building might soften in the face of a genuine family crisis. 4 days before the surgery, Kayla mentioned, during a call with Michael that he later relayed to me, that a major regional bridal expo, one she'd apparently been anticipating for months, having secured a coveted early access pass through her event planning industry connections, happened to fall on the exact date of my surgery. She explained to Michael that the expo represented a rare opportunity to meet directly with several premier vendors, whose calendars filled up nearly a year in advance. Vendors she believed were essential to securing the specific wedding vision she'd been building. Michael told me, during a phone call 2 days before my surgery, that Kayla had decided to attend the expo rather than accompany him to the hospital, a decision he relayed with visible discomfort, clearly uncertain how to frame it in a way that wouldn't upset me further given everything else I was already managing. "Mom," he said, "Kayla feels terrible about the timing, but this expo apparently only happens once a year, and she's worried if she misses it, we'll lose access to vendors we really want. I'll be there the whole time, obviously. Don't worry about that. I just wanted you to know the actual plan before the day itself." I want to be honest about what I felt hearing that explanation. 2 days before major heart surgery, already managing considerable anxiety about the procedure itself. It wasn't primarily anger in that moment, though some sting was certainly present. It was something closer to a quiet, resigned disappointment. The particular feeling of watching a pattern I'd been noticing for months finally reveal its full shape plainly, spoken aloud rather than simply implied through smaller, more deniable moments. I didn't push back significantly. I told Michael I understood, that the expo sounded important for their planning, sentiments that were genuine even as they sat alongside a real, aching hurt I chose not to fully express, not wanting to add guilt to what I understood was already an uncomfortable position for my son, caught between his mother and his fiancée in a way I didn't want to make harder than it already was. The surgery happened as scheduled, 5 weeks ago now, a genuinely serious procedure that kept me in intensive care for the first 2 days, requiring several additional days of hospital observation before I was stable enough to return home with appropriate support in place. I remember very little of the first day after surgery, the particular disorienting fog of anesthesia and pain medication, but I remember clearly, on the second night, waking briefly in the dim quiet of the ICU and reaching instinctively for a hand that wasn't there, an old habit from decades of Walter being present during difficult moments, a reflex my body apparently hadn't yet unlearned even 8 years after his passing. Michael was there throughout, exactly as he'd promised, in the waiting room during the procedure itself, at my bedside during the difficult first days of recovery, managing conversations with my medical team with a steadiness that I will be grateful for as long as I live, sleeping some nights in an uncomfortable hospital chair rather than going home, simply so I wouldn't wake alone. Kayla did not visit the hospital at all during those 5 days. I learned, partly from Michael and partly from a photograph I saw later, posted publicly, showing Kayla laughing brightly at a cake-tasting table, surrounded by elaborate floral displays, that she had spent the entirety of my surgery day and the following several days fully immersed in wedding planning activities, texting Michael periodically for updates on my condition but never once, across those 5 days, appearing in person. I remember Michael showing me that photograph much later, hesitantly, wanting me to understand something he himself was still processing, the particular strange dissonance of seeing his fiancée's joyful expression captured at florist tables while his mother lay recovering from surgery that could have killed her. I want to be honest about what that hospital stay felt like, particularly during the loneliest hours of the second night, when Michael had finally gone home briefly to sleep, and I lay in that hospital bed, my chest aching from the surgery itself, absorbing the specific reality that my daughter-in-law had chosen cake samples over my recovery from a procedure my own cardiologist had described, plainly as genuinely life-threatening if delayed. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles of that hospital room, counting them the way you count things in the middle of the night when sleep won't come, and feeling, underneath the physical pain, a quieter, more specific ache that had nothing to do with my heart's surgical incisions and everything to do with a different kind of wound entirely. I was discharged after 5 days, moving carefully with restricted activity, requiring in-home support to manage basic daily tasks during those first fragile weeks of recovery. Kayla visited my house once during that first week home, bringing flowers and expressing what seemed like genuine, if somewhat rehearsed, remorse about missing the hospital days, attributing it primarily to the expo's rare, once-yearly timing and her professional obligation to secure the best possible vendors for the wedding. I didn't confront her directly during that visit. I was still genuinely weak, still managing significant pain and the particular disorientation that follows major heart surgery, and I found I simply didn't have the reserves for a difficult conversation on top of everything else my body was navigating during that fragile first week home. I accepted her brief visit, her flowers, her somewhat rehearsed-sounding explanation, and let the larger unspoken hurt remain unspoken, at least for the moment. 5 days after that brief visit, on a Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Kayla, and I could hear immediately, in the strained, careful quality of her voice, that something important was occupying her attention. "Eleanor," she said, "I need to talk to you about something, and I know the timing might feel strange, but I've been thinking about this a lot, and I need your help with something important." She explained, over the following 20 minutes, that the specific venue she and Michael had settled on for the wedding, a genuinely beautiful property that had apparently become the singular focus of months of planning, required a substantial deposit within the next week to secure the date, a deposit that exceeded what she and Michael had currently saved, given the considerable other expenses already accumulated across 18 months of increasingly elaborate wedding planning. She described the venue in detail, the specific gardens, the historic building, clearly having researched every element thoroughly, her voice carrying genuine, animated enthusiasm that felt strange to hear so soon after the careful, subdued tone she'd used during her earlier apology visit. The trust has provisions for early distributions in certain circumstances, right? She said. Michael mentioned that to me once, that you could authorize an early distribution if there was a genuine need. Eleanor, I know this might feel like a lot to ask right now, especially so soon after your surgery, but if we lose this venue, we lose the date we've been planning around for over a year, and honestly, I don't know where else to turn. I've already looked into every other option, savings, an additional loan, family on my own side, and this is genuinely the only path forward that gets us there in time. I sat with that request for a long moment, absorbing the specific, uncomfortable irony of the timing. 5 days after being told, plainly and rehearsed, that a bridal expo had simply been too important to miss during my heart surgery, I was now being asked to authorize significant funds from a trust I'd spent decades carefully protecting. Funds that depended entirely on my judgment and my signature, the very trust and authority that had apparently mattered considerably less than cake samples just 10 days earlier. I found myself thinking, almost involuntarily, of Walter's words from decades earlier, about the trust existing specifically so someone who loved this family would be paying attention before significant money moved. And I wondered, sitting there with the phone against my ear, whether paying attention now meant something considerably more complicated than simply signing what she was asking for. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. My first instinct was not entirely generous. Part of me wanted to point out, plainly, the uncomfortable contrast between her absence during my surgery and her sudden, urgent need for something only I could authorize, to ask directly why my signature and my judgment suddenly mattered so much now, when my actual presence and survival had apparently mattered so little just days earlier. Part of me wanted to simply say no, to let natural consequences play out without my intervention. But I thought of Walter and the particular way he always approached difficult family moments, with honesty, always, but never with cruelty, never using hurt as leverage, simply because he happened to hold it in a given moment. And I thought about Michael, who bore no responsibility for Kayla's choices during my surgery, and about whatever future they were building together, one I still genuinely hoped could be a happy one, regardless of the pain I was currently carrying. Kayla, I said slowly, I'm going to think seriously about this request, because Michael's happiness matters enormously to me. But before we go any further, I need you to actually hear something from me clearly, not as a condition of my help, but because I don't think it's been said plainly yet, and I think it needs to be. Okay, she said quietly, and I could hear her bracing herself. You knew I was having open-heart surgery 5 weeks ago, I said. You knew the date nearly 2 weeks in advance, and you chose a bridal expo over being present for that surgery, a procedure my own doctor described as genuinely life-threatening if delayed. You didn't visit once during the 5 days I spent in that hospital, and now, 10 days after making that choice, you're calling me asking me to authorize a significant distribution from a trust that exists entirely because I've spent decades exercising careful judgment about protecting this family's resources. I need you to actually sit with that timeline, Kayla, because I don't think you've fully looked at what it reveals about how you're currently weighing what matters. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. You're right, Kayla finally said, her voice breaking. Eleanor, I've felt sick about the hospital thing since almost the moment I heard how serious your surgery actually was. I told myself, going into that expo, that Michael had it handled, that my presence specifically wasn't going to change your medical outcome. But that's a convenient story, I told myself, to justify choosing something I genuinely badly wanted to attend. I got so wrapped up in this wedding, in building something that felt perfect and impressive, that I think I lost sight of what actually mattered more. And I'm ashamed, hearing you lay out that timeline so plainly, at how it must look from where you're sitting. I appreciate you being honest about that, I said. And Kayla, I want you to understand something important. I'm not saying this to punish you or to refuse this request indefinitely. Michael's wedding and his happiness with you genuinely matters to me. But I needed you to actually hear this clearly first, because if I simply authorized this distribution without ever naming what happened, I think you'd walk away from this having learned that my presence and my recovery don't actually carry consequences, since help arrives anyway, regardless of what you prioritize. I hear you, Kayla said. I really do, and I promise you this isn't going to be something I apologize for once and then continue the same pattern. I think I've spent the last year and a half letting this wedding become something that overshadowed almost everything else, including people who deserved better from me. And hearing you say this so directly is making me actually confront that in a way I hadn't let myself do before now. We talked for a while longer that afternoon, a conversation that went considerably deeper than either the surgery or the venue deposit individually, touching on a broader pattern Kayla recognized in herself, a tendency, developed over months of increasingly elaborate wedding planning, to treat nearly every competing obligation as secondary to whatever moved the wedding vision forward, sometimes at real cost to relationships that deserved more consistent priority. I told her honestly that I was willing to help with the venue deposit, but that I wanted her to visit me in person first, without Michael present, to have a fuller conversation about what had actually happened and what I needed to see reflected differently going forward, not as a punishment, but because I genuinely believed the underlying relationship needed real repair, not simply a resolved financial transaction that let the deeper issue go unaddressed. Kayla visited 2 days later, arriving with a handwritten letter that she read aloud to me, sitting at my kitchen table, a genuinely thorough apology that acknowledged not just the surgery itself, but the broader pattern of treating family obligations as flexible whenever wedding planning felt more urgent. She asked real questions about my recovery, about what those 5 days in the hospital had actually been like for me, questions she hadn't asked during her earlier, briefer visit. Listening carefully as I described the particular loneliness of that second night, her eyes filling with tears more than once as I spoke. She told me, near the end of that visit, that she'd grown up in a household where appearances and events had always carried enormous weight, her own mother having built much of her identity around hosting the perfect gathering, and that some part of her had absorbed, without ever fully examining it, the belief that a beautifully executed wedding might matter more than almost anything else happening around it. I don't think I ever consciously decided that, Eleanor, she said. I think I just inherited it, and I never stopped to ask whether it was actually true. I authorized the trust distribution the following week, working with my attorney to structure it appropriately, and the venue deposit was secured in time, the date preserved. But more significantly, in the weeks since that conversation, something has genuinely shifted in how Kayla shows up, both for me and, from what Michael has mentioned, in her broader approach to balancing wedding planning against other relationships and obligations in their life together. She's visited more consistently since our conversation, not just logistically, but to actually sit with me, to ask about my cardiac rehabilitation progress, to drive me to a follow-up appointment 2 weeks ago that she specifically rearranged her work schedule to attend, sitting with me in the waiting room and asking the cardiologist genuine, informed questions about my recovery timeline. Michael mentioned that Kayla had also started pulling back slightly on some of the more elaborate wedding elements she'd been pursuing, telling him, in his words, that she wanted the day to actually reflect their relationship rather than becoming something that consumed every other priority in their lives. She canceled, he said, a second Bridal Expo she'd originally planned to attend the following month, telling him she'd rather spend that particular weekend with family instead, a small but meaningful shift given everything that had happened. Last week, Kayla asked if I would be willing to help her think through a few remaining wedding decisions. Not for financial reasons this time, but genuinely wanting my perspective and involvement. An invitation that felt, given everything that had happened, like a meaningful shift toward the relationship I'd originally hoped we might build together. We spent an afternoon together going through fabric swatches and seating arrangements, ordinary wedding planning tasks that felt, given the distance we'd traveled to arrive at that ordinary afternoon, quietly significant in their own right. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old woman whose daughter-in-law chose a bridal expo over her heart surgery. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The choices we make about where to show up, especially during someone else's genuine crisis, reveal our actual priorities far more honestly than any later apology can undo on its own. Real repair requires naming that revelation clearly and honestly, not simply moving forward as though the absence didn't happen, before extending whatever help comes next. I spent 5 days recovering from major heart surgery. My own daughter-in-law chose not to attend, prioritizing a bridal expo instead. 10 days later, she needed something only my judgment and signature could authorize. I gave her that help, but not before making certain she understood, clearly and honestly, exactly what her absence had cost, and exactly what kind of consistent presence I expected to see reflected differently going forward. If this story reminded you of someone in your life who's let planning and appearances outweigh presence in the moments that actually mattered, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and consider whether the honest conversation Kayla and I finally had might be one worth having in your own family too.